Behavior change is at the heart of health, wellness, and performance, the driving force toward better than yesterday, the fuel for making the most of this thing called life. So why does it have to be so difficult? And are there any evidence-based strategies that can help us, our team members, and our clients move forward more effectively? Today's guest, Professor Martin Hagger, has spent a lifetime studying the answers to those questions, and I think you'll be encouraged by the answers. Welcome to the Catalyst 360 podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brad Cooper of Catalyst Coaching 360, and we're grateful to have you spend a little portion of your week with us. If this is your first episode, great spot to start. If you like what you hear, we literally have a library of 280 episodes devoted to providing engaging evidence-based guidance on all three health, wellness, and performance that are waiting for you. Today's guest, Professor Hagger, studies how psychological constructs such as attitudes, intentions, motives, self-efficacy, planning, and personality traits affect our behaviors. In addition to his role as a professor of health psychology at the University of California, he's been a visiting professor in Rome, Hong Kong, Australia, Bordeaux, and today's location, Finland. If you're a health and wellness coach and you've not yet registered for the Rocky Mountain Coaching Retreat and Symposium that's on tap in gorgeous Estes Park, Colorado this September, you're just about out of time. This is the event of the year for health and wellness coaches, but space is limited, and we're getting close. All the details, including the 6-month no-interest option and the discount for groups of coaches attending together, are available under the Retreat tab on our Institute site at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. And for the employers, EAPs, or wellness service providers looking for the very best in coaching, Catalyst Coaching 360 might just be the solution you've been seeking. Contact us at your convenience, results@catalystcoaching360.com, or visit the website catalystcoaching360.com to learn more about what makes CC360 the coaching provider of choice for so many. And now it's time to take a deeper dive into the realities of behavior change and the strategies that can bring it to fruition with Professor Martin Hagger on the latest episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast. Professor Hagger, great to have you here. We are doing this across the world, which is always amazing. You're in Finland right now. You've been all over the place. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brad. Pleasure to be here.
Let's jump into the basics right out of the gate. Why is behavior change so doggone difficult? I mean, this is core to life. Why is it so hard?
I think mainly because people become fairly ingrained in the kinds of behaviors that they regularly perform. And it's also because many of the behaviors that we do, which perhaps we maybe shouldn't do, are highly rewarding. And those highly rewarding behaviors are really gratifying. And I think, a lot of people know that those behaviors are the kinds that they shouldn't be doing, or the behaviors that they should be doing, at least in moderation. And yet, of course, a lot of the behaviors are reinforced, and the environment also makes it very difficult. The environment itself is reinforcing, so it makes it very difficult for people to change spontaneously.
So the phrase highly rewarding, there's so much to that, just those two words.
Yep.
So highly rewarding to long-term, not necessarily, to short-term, maybe, to how does the body, the brain decipher how to figure out which cue am I following here? Because the rewards they're across the board. There's guilt, there's pleasure, there's long-term enjoyment, there's better health, there's worse health, there's better relationships. We could do this list for 3 hours and not be done yet. How does the brain, how does the individual peel through all those and decide which one's going to drive right now's behavior?
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately, what makes humans as a species extremely adaptive and extremely, successful is their capacity to forego impulses. Actually, that is fairly central to human behavior. If you are, whether it's holding down a job or studying for a degree or just becoming proficient in a language or at a sports skill, all of these tasks require long-term focused application. People are generally pretty good at that.
Yeah.
And all of the environment that we've created for ourselves as a species, all the technology, all the construction, all of our systems, financial system, education system, healthcare system, all this kind of stuff, all of those technologies are due to that capacity to forego these sort of fairly innate impulses, or at least a major component of that. And of course, in addition to that, we have very sophisticated brains, of course. That said, those impulses are still there. And those impulses are those which kind of drive fundamental, often adaptive behaviors. For example, eating when food is plentiful. That's adaptive if you're, I don't know, a hunter-gatherer.
Sure.
Right? Because you don't know where your next meal may come from, because you need to eat when there's at a time of plenty, because that may not be the case tomorrow. Now, in our current society, that's very seldom the case. And so we have plentiful food. We have, we also have very rich, very nutritious, in inverted commas, food. And therefore, we don't need to forage, and there is always going to be plenty, right? And so as a result, and also we have industries that develop food which is appealing to our impulses. Right. And so as a result, we have environments that work in conjunction with our impulses, which are fairly innate, and our drives, in order to, obviously, ultimately, is to sell products. And, nutritionists talk of obesogenic environments. That's what we've created for ourselves and generated for ourselves over a number of years. And so as a result, our sort of greatest successes are actually working against us. So that's a very kind of structural, broad sort of overview. But that's the case. And so it's extremely difficult to kind of get out of that scenario. And also as a result, to forego those extremely rewarding type of behaviors is actually extremely challenging, because you have advertising, because you have very cheap, energy dense foods, because you have highly available alcoholic beverages, because we've managed to reduce the advertising and so on of tobacco, but there are other insidious ways that the tobacco industry markets cigarettes and nicotine and all of these kinds of products. And that's taken on a different, that's now on a different scale or different perspective when you look at products like vaping and e-cigarettes. And at the same time, we also have greater automation, and it's very easy to be relatively inactive.
Sit around all day.
And so a lot of those things kind of work against us, and that's why it's so challenging. And it's because we've been very successful as a species, and we've generated an environment that's made life easy for ourselves.
Yeah. And we're going to go into all the different elements that you've studied, the attitudes, intentions, self-efficacy, that kind of stuff. Before we do that, we had Dr. Kelly McGonigal on this is a couple of years ago, and she mentioned, kind of in passing with a smirk on her face, that oftentimes research is actually me-search. How did you get here? What brought you to study behavior change? Was it discovering something in your own life? Was it seeing a gap that you were trying to figure out a better way to do that? Was it seeing people? What brought you here? Was it an element of me search in this research the path that you ran down?
Yeah, to some extent, and I think that's you're right. That's true for a lot of researchers. And so I was an athlete, but I always enjoyed. I actually kind of enjoyed the training and the sort of the exercise part more than the competing part.
I'm with you in a lot of ways. Yep.
And so in the end, when I kind of I still compete, but just not as frequently. And so really, I'm a sort of exerciser. And as a consequence, I was always fascinated. I've always been attracted to exercise and sport and those kinds of things. But I always wanted to discover why quite a lot of the population were not. And, I think that translated ultimately to just living a healthy lifestyle. And so, yeah, there's an element of that, but I'm also I've expanded my horizons as I've kind of moved on in my research career. And I'm also interested in a lot of other kind of behaviors that are important and have important outcomes. Like, for example, I'm currently doing some work with colleagues on floodwater prevention with colleagues at Griffith University, and so preventing people from driving through floodwaters. I'm doing some research on e-scooter use, again with the same group of researchers, my close collaborator. And these are kind of behaviors that are sort of real problems, because there are a lot of accidents with e-scooter use, and of course people driving through floodwaters is potentially life-threatening. And so I've become interested in other behaviors which kind of have a health or safety element to them, but they're not directly in health behaviors like physical activity or eating healthily and so forth. Yeah.
What was one of the biggest surprises as you got into your research? You may be going back a decade here or something, but was there something that as you got into the depths and it was removed from the me search of what you knew about yourself, what you've seen in yourself, where the broader population, you went, what is that? Can that be true? Was there a moment that you remember thinking, wow, like I never expected to find that?
I wouldn't say there's not necessarily a eureka moment or a finding that was necessarily blown away by, but maybe I'd overestimated the extent of sort of how prevalent or how consistent the finding was. And that was, you tell people, or you inform them of the risks of their behavior. And you tell them that these kinds of behaviors are bad for you, and these are the consequences. Or you even tell them that these are the problems that you have, and this is the way to solve them. That doesn't actually make much difference.
Almost never.
Right. And most behavioral scientists, any behavioral scientists worth their salt, will tell you that. Yeah. Right. You're not going to change people's behavior by telling them that what they're doing is bad for them. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Think about how many physicians are chain smokers. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Nurses. And so they know the consequences of their behavior. Right. And so, and then they're clearly intelligent people, but they have these unhealthy habits. It's a finding that's far more prevalent and far more broad than you'd ever expect.
Yeah, it's interesting. We obviously, a lot of folks that listen are health and wellness coaches, or they're kind of leaning into that potential in the future, and that seems to be the biggest surprise for them as well as they come in, especially when clinicians become certified, like physical therapists, nurses, physicians, counselors, because they're used to being the expert and telling people what to do. And then when they get into coaching, they realize, wait, telling a person to do something in physical therapy is very different than this habit change they're trying to create. Information does not equal application. Almost ever. There are exceptions to that. All right, let's jump into the 10,000-foot view on some of these things that you've focused in terms of the psychological constructs. So I've got a list in front of me. Let's start with attitudes, and we'll just move our way through them. So where does the attitude influence behavior change?
Yeah, so what are the sort of typical ways in which you might approach changing people's attitudes, for example? And attitudes is an interesting concept or construct, because there's huge amounts of research on attitudes, years and years and years, 60 years of research on attitudes. And yet, researchers, social psychologists still debate this idea of, do attitudes predict behavior? Are they consistently related? And intuitively, you would think that. And it kind of relates to what I was saying about people's, if people know that something is bad for them, you'd expect, and they have attitudes that reflect their beliefs about performing the behavior, and it's going to lead to sort of, I don't know, poor or maladaptive, negative outcomes for them. You'd think, well, clearly that will be, they'll change or alter their behavior accordingly, and that's not the case. And that is a serious problem within research, because intuitively, originally, theorists would say, okay, if you have your attitudes would drive your behavior. And attitudes reflect your beliefs and opinions, perspective, positive or negative, towards a particular behavior, a particular object, person, whatever. And actually, it's not true. But there are caveats to that. So researchers have then progressed to say, okay, well, what is it? When do attitudes? What factors might determine when attitudes are related to behavior? And one perspective is that those attitudes have to have high value, or the behavior and the outcome of the behavior that you're trying to change has to have value to the individual. And so when you look at people's beliefs and their attitudes, and you target or you identify the attitudes and the beliefs that have meaning to the individual, you're much more likely to tap into something that's going to change their behavior. So it's relevant, specific outcomes that people, and the ones that people value, that are more likely to lead to behavior change. And as an interventionist, somebody who's perhaps developing messages or interventions that are trying to change people's behavior, you got to tap into those attitudes.
And so as a researcher, how are you peeling that back? Because you see stuff out there even about religion to marriage, devotion, or, cheating on your spouse with this belief system. How do you peel out the person who says, I believe this is part of my belief system, and the person actually really believes it? Or take that with eating. I want to eat healthy. There's a difference between saying that and really deeply believing that. Or activity levels. I believe activity is important. Do you really though? Like, how do you peel through the stated belief and the true attitude of what really matters to me as an individual?
Yeah. I mean, I think there people have a hierarchy of beliefs, and they attach values at different levels, and often you have sort of competing values. Yeah, and always. You're right. People might very well sort of say, okay, well, I value exercise, but I just don't have the time. Or, I want to eat healthily, but, right. Pizza, burgers, they just taste too darn good. Exactly. Right. And so, what you need to do there, I mean, that is those kind of, those are the people whose behavior is most difficult to change, because their belief systems are fairly ingrained. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's a big challenge. And those involve much more intense interventions, where you need to explore where the options are for change. And often that is finding the behavior that leads to a sort of compromise, and that also doesn't lead to them giving up those most prized or those most highly valued behaviors, so that those behaviors can therefore coexist as part of their repertoire of behaviors that they perform on a regular basis. And that takes very intense and very kind of long-term interventions to actually kind of tap into that. And often I would argue that would probably necessitate some sort of facilitator, counselor, practitioner-led intervention.
Is part of that is the concept that the goal or the approach that works is not to simply stop something and then create a vacuum, but rather to pursue something of value that ends up replacing that. So rather than saying, I'm not going to eat any more pizza, I'm not going to eat any more hot dogs, you find something that you really enjoy, you let yourself have that stuff, but eventually that takes over. Is there any piece of that, of the stopping, I'm not going to do this anymore? Okay, but what are you going to do? Like, what fills that gap? That's a vacuum. That's a black hole. Yep. You're going to fill it with something. And if we're not filling it with something of value or higher value, then we end up failing anyway. Does that play into this?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly. And I think, you're not going to get people to change unless they're willing to change. And that willingness will come from finding or identifying the kinds of alternatives that you're talking about. But at the same time, denying, the behaviors that people value the most, whether it's sort of an inactive behavior relative to physical activity or certain foods, those kinds of things, if you're talking about, nutrition or diet change. That I would argue that was probably doomed to failure. Because you're right there. If you completely deny, and this is why crash diets, those kinds of things, are not a panacea for behavior change. They ultimately lead to relapse, and we've got good data on that. And ultimately, probably the most effective behavior change focuses on small changes. Gradually, and being also quite focused, but making sure that the identified alternative behaviors that you introduce alongside the behaviors ultimately you want to change are ones that are highly valued, but also come from the person themselves. And again, we also have very good data on identifying, on the need to identify core behaviors that ultimately that people ultimately value, and it comes from the person. Right. And there's a very good sort of a strategy or approach called motivational interviewing, which is all about client-centered change. And one of the fundamental principles of motivational interviewing is the idea of trying to reduce or minimize the idea of psychological reactants. And if you tell someone to do that, they must do something, they should do something, as a practitioner or as a coach or whatever, if they're not really receptive, if they haven't internalized what you're saying to them, then you have this natural psychological reactance, which is basically WTF. Who are you to tell me what to do, right? And as a consequence, they either shut you out or they disengage. And of course, that's counterproductive, especially when you're trying to reach people who just, who are fairly resistant to change.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. We had Bill Miller on the podcast years ago. I shouldn't say years ago. Yeah. He was on last year. So our coaches know that motivational interviewing is critical. It's a key element. So it's awesome to have you bring that into the conversation here. The next one I've got on my list.
I'm a big fan.
Oh yeah, it's good stuff. Jonathan Fader, you probably know Jonathan too. He joined us as well. Nice. So next one I've got here in terms of the psychological constructs is intentions. Where does that play a role in this whole behavior change process or journey?
Yeah, intentions are they reflect people's motivation, really. And so your level of intention reflects the sort of intensity with which you might sort of pursue a particular behavior. Low intentions, probably unlikely. If you have low intention, you're probably unlikely to do behavior. That's not always the case, of course, because that's got to be juxtaposed with how your behavior is controlled or determined.
Right.
And we see that often people, have or develop habits. Their intentions generally tend to be aligned with those habitual behaviors, but actually it's the habit that's driving the behavior. And if you kind of look at them together, it's the habit that's doing the work in predicting people's behavior rather than the intention. So you get much stronger effects of habit, much smaller effects of intention when you look at them both simultaneously. And actually that's kind of very consistent with people's researchers and theorists' ideas on habits, that they initially develop as something we kind of intend to do, but over a period of time, they become habitual. And so actually the intention doesn't matter that much.
Does it matter early, but it doesn't matter late or middle, or does it really not matter at all?
No, most likely. Intentions are important when it comes to behaviors you're developing or you're just starting out. If you're a novice, performing that behavior. Of course, you've got to kind of weigh up the benefits, the costs and benefits of performing the behavior. You've got to kind of think about your whether you can do the behavior. You've got to organize whether it's of value to you. You've got to talk about or think about your capacity to do the behavior. All these kinds of perceptions drive that kind of behavior. But over time, if you repeat the behavior regularly, if it's the kind of behavior that's also potentially very rewarding, and if you do it in this sort of stable context, that's, you have the same environment, the same people with you, that eventually develops into a habit. And so the intention becomes less important. But the flip side is, of course, if you want to change behavior, right? Often you have to consciously and deliberatively, and you have to be highly motivated, high intention, to change a behavior for which a habit has developed. And so often your intention is integral for you intervening to change a bad habit. That doesn't necessarily mean you will change that bad habit, but it really does take that sort of deliberative, effortful intervention, on the part of the person to actually change their behavior. So that's the sort of juxtaposition and how intentions and habits kind of operate when it comes to driving people's behavior.
So it's almost like intention is the spark, habit is the sustainer.
Yeah. In terms of developing behaviors that ultimately become habits. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, intention or motivation is what gets you started. Habit is what keeps you going. You're right. And if you're trying to change people's behavior, you can capitalize on that. You can actually help people develop behaviors that are adaptive and good habits. The trouble is it can also work against you, because people will develop bad habits as well if the environment is conducive to that. So the environment interacts with the person
in big time,
and so that's really important. And that again, as it sort of goes to what I was talking about earlier, and that sort of very sort of evolutionary perspective I gave on how we've got to this situation where a lot of people have unhealthy habits. A lot of it is the interaction between the environment, which becomes very good at reinforcing these kinds of behaviors. And those reinforcers basically motivate ultimately people to do these kinds of behaviors, but they ultimately also are very conducive to performing the behavior lots and lots of times and in the same context. And so as a consequence, you slowly build up the habit. And actually a very sort of interesting perspective comes from nicotine addiction. So actually nicotine, the addictive properties of nicotine, or the addictive consequences of nicotine can get washed out relatively quickly from an individual. But it actually, that's, as we know, just quitting smoking for a few days doesn't ultimately reduce those cravings. And actually people become socially addicted to smoking itself, the cues and so forth. So cigarette smoking and most habits are actually a fusion between the sort of rewarding aspect of the behavior, but also the sort of the associations that develop between the behavior itself and the context and all the surroundings and performing the behavior. So cigarette cravings will be a result not necessarily only of
chemical
nicotine withdrawal, but also of the fact that 10 a.m. I usually have a cigarette.
Totally.
I wake up in the morning, first thing I have is a coffee and a cigarette.
Yeah. Or Charlie and I meet at the break time and we talk politics or, whatever.
Right. Yeah. Right. So you become conditioned to those contexts, and it's paired up with those behaviors over a long period of time, reinforced through the biochemical addiction as well. And so you get this very strong habits.
So my PhD work focused on a concept we called functional mental toughness. And so when people see that, they're like, oh, like David Goggins. And I'm like, no, not like David Goggins. And my perspective has been, and I'd like some correction here if I'm on the wrong track, is David, in your wording here, is kind of the intentions guy. He's the in-your-face, get your butt together, get out there, just get it rolling. Whereas our research focused more on, and then what? Like, what are the changes that you then build off of? What would be, let's talk David just for a moment. You're familiar with his videos and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Where do you see his role? Is his role in the intention piece primarily, or what would be your thoughts there?
To some extent, I think it's very sort of in your face shock value, that kind of approach. That can work, but I think only for some people. And it can work because if you're the kind of person who will internalize that and you say, okay, this guy is doing something, or this person is doing something that I value, if you've bought into that, it can work, right? But I think it's very much to do with the individual. And often it's because that person is highly motivated to change their behavior for whatever reason.
Right.
And if those reasons are salient or important to them, right, then that might help them. And there are also individual differences. Some people that kind of approach appeals to them. And I know people who are exercisers, and they sort of say, well, I need the personal trainer. I need or I do boot camp. I need the kind of the guy standing over me telling me that I'm weak, and I need to kind of pull myself together, and 50 more, et cetera, right? And the people who attend boot camps are those kind of people, right? And so that very much, and that's because they've internalized, they've taken on board, and they think this person is telling me stuff that is valuable because I know it's going to get me to where I want to be, which is fitter and so forth. And they know, and this comes from a little bit of self-insight, they know that they won't be able to do that on their own, right? Or a lot of people who attend these kinds of sort of boot camps and approaches, a lot of people who value that kind of approach will know that. But often they've arrived at that through kind of trial and error, or they've stumbled on it, or somebody's told them this might be a good idea. And so they kind of gain that self-awareness through circumstance. That might work for some people, but it doesn't necessarily work for everybody.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so that actually kind of leads us into the self-efficacy piece. Where does self-efficacy play a role in behavior change? And I've got some stuff floating around in my head, but fill us in on this one. It seems like it's a critical area for long term.
I agree. Yeah, hugely important. And
maybe define it out of the gate, because you and I are talking like, self-efficacy.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. So self-efficacy is it reflects people's beliefs in whether they have the capacity, the resources, the wherewithal to do something, to perform a behavior, to perform a task. And so the sort of easy way to kind of define it are I can type beliefs. I can do this behavior. And it all dates back to Albert Bandura's seminal work on social learning theory. And basically, he found that people who have clinical phobias were much more effective ultimately at changing, and he could predict very easily whether they were able to overcome their phobias, people like snake phobics, if they were confident in being able to approach the object of their phobia. And he did this through a form of observational learning, a form of therapy where you slowly introduce the person to the object of their phobia, and over a period of time increase people's level of familiarity, their confidence in being able to perform that behavior. So effectively, it's about people's perceptions of confidence in being able to perform a task, a behavior, and so on. And his work is extremely influential and prescient. It's still really influential today. We have lots of studies, lots of research based on his work, which has been, advanced and so forth, that demonstrates that self-efficacy is fairly critical to people performing behaviors, particularly performing behaviors that they either haven't done before or that are really, really important and adaptive for them.
Is it area or concept specific? Because someone can be have a very high self-efficacy in their academic ability and yet have zero confidence in their ability to go to the gym or work out or whatever. And by the same token, somebody can be, lights out on the exercise front and feel very little ability to change how they study or their commitment to school pursuits so is it area specific or is there a
very
crossover?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. I mean, there is this sort of notion that there's sort of generalized self-efficacy. So sort of your overall confidence, that's your sort of general tendency to be sort of fairly confident in lots of different situations. And we know people, we all know people like that. But the effects of generalized self-efficacy tend to, like many kind of individual differences, personality factors tend to be pretty weak. So yes, self-efficacy is and tend to get washed out when you look at situational factors. Right? So
it's almost like they're good. They're not actors, but we're seeing them only in athletic or academic settings. And so we assume they have strong self-efficacy across the board. But the reality is it's where we're seeing them.
Right. I mean, yeah. I mean, you do get these sort of confident people who appear to be confident in lots of situations. They may have very high generalized self-efficacy, which may therefore be important. But actually, they also probably, like you say, you see them in those situations. They also probably have high situation-specific self-confidence, self-efficacy in those contexts. Right. And there may very well be situations where they don't have high self-efficacy. But like you say, probably you might not see them and acting in those situations. And, we all play to our strengths in many ways. And so, confidence is often, linked to the kinds of behaviors where we are most comfortable. Right. Yeah. So our comfort zone. Right. And so, you often see people are confident in the behaviors that they do regularly and the behaviors that they excel in because we're attracted to the things that we excel in. And those are things that we also tend to spend a lot of time on. And that naturally reinforces that confidence. So, you look at people who, their hobbies, people pretty confident around their hobbies. And that's because they choose to do them. They do them a lot. They practice them and so forth.
So the note I'm jotting down here is that then a strategy for behavior change of, okay, so I want to change, let's just take food. I want to eat better. And I'm a very good student. Like, is there a way to take an apparently unrelated area and say, okay, so really good academically, want to eat more healthy. How can is that a thing? Or do we really need to address healthy eating in that specific context? Yeah. Can you springboard off of a strength, I guess is what I'm asking. Can you say, okay, you're really good in this area or I'm really good in this area. And so I'm going to use that as a foundation for this apparently unrelated area.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the nail there just at the end. I think the closeness in the similarities in the context is pretty important. So if it's totally unrelated, probably less likely to have that translation or that cross context similarity in beliefs. And so in many ways you're kind of tapping into that idea that, well, maybe if you're confident in one area, maybe you'll be confident in another, or maybe you could apply those principles. That is not necessarily the case. But Bandura's perspective is that there are a number of things you can do to foster self-efficacy, self-confidence in in any sort of behavioral situation. The first is what he calls mastery experiences. So can you master something? And one way of doing that is just giving people practice and starting them slow or starting them small. You don't suddenly pick up a tennis racket and hit a forehand like Novak Djokovic, right? No, that's not going to happen, right? So you start people small and you start them with initial practices, and they slowly grow their confidence, and that improves their self-efficacy. So mastery experience is really important. Another way to do that is through vicarious experience. So actually, we learn a lot of our behaviors by watching others. And so demonstrations, those kinds of things, seeing other people perform the behavior, a model effectively, is also really important. So actually, that's what Bandura was on about when he did the research on snake phobics. Observing other people handling snakes and so forth, allowed the phobics to slowly approach the snake and do it themselves. And then there's positive feedback. So if you give people really good feedback, and it's clearly says you're doing well and notes your progress, which suggests you're getting better, that will give you more confidence in the future. And then there's sort of being emotionally positive about the behavior and not anxious. And so you can give by giving people self-confidence, or by reassuring them about their behavior through positive feedback, you reduce the anxiety. And anxiety is a major distractor. And so it keeps people focused. And positive emotions are also quite reinforcing. So that gives people confidence. So those are the kind of 4 areas that Bandura talked about when it comes to promoting self-efficacy in any given sort of behavioral situation.
All right, we got 2 more, seemingly completely unrelated. Planning is the next one, and then we'll talk about personality traits. How does planning play a role in our behavior change?
Yeah, no, planning has been identified as a really important construct and mechanism for promoting better behavior change. Some people are just great at planning. This is usually the case when planning is usually most important when it comes to people who have already reasonably motivated to perform a behavior, but they perhaps haven't gone over the edge to kind of start making changes or making regular changes to that behavior. And planning is all about kind of basically furnishing your good intentions with actual strategies, with actual means to get you to do the behavior.
Yes.
And, the classic example is sort of, New Year's resolutions, right?
Yes.
New Year's resolutions, people sort of say, oh yeah, I want to be healthier this year. That's too vague, right? And that's linked to low commitment.
Totally.
Okay. But I'm not talking about those ones. Actually, some people will say, I want to do more of this particular behavior. I want to start eating healthy. I want to eat more of this, or I want to do more physical activity. Those kinds of things for their New Year's resolution. Those kinds of New Year's resolutions may have real commitment behind them, but what people very seldom do is actually think, what are the steps I need to do in order to change that? They very seldom do that. So there's no plan. So often these kinds of New Year's resolutions fall by the wayside after a few days or few weeks. And so having very concrete or clear plans can actually help you move forward. And that's where planning comes in. It's really about kind of getting people to act on their intentions.
And to think through what's likely going to get in the way. We have coaches all the time tell us around New Year's resolutions where people say, okay, I'm going to work out 3 times a week. And the inexperienced coach will say, okay, cool, great. I'll write you down. You're going to be working out 3 times a week. The experienced coach says something like, what time? What are you currently doing at that time?
Right.
Will that work on Monday at that time? Oh no, I got to take my kid to school. I can't do it Monday. Okay. So we know that already. Now what are we going to do? So That's huge. So, little subtle tweak here. We talk a lot about vision setting up the plan. Does vision play a role at all here? When you have a vision of you being a healthy person, or you have a vision of you being a contribute to research models, when you see yourself, whatever it is, that clear vision of the person you're becoming, does that influence this process of behavior change at all?
It can be. Yeah, it's a useful strategy. We often talk about, visualization or imagery. And and actually, the where we have reasonable data, or it's not conclusive, but reasonable data, is it's actually the visualization or the imagery of the steps you need to take to get there, rather than the outcome itself.
Right.
Yes, visualizing the outcome can be motivating, but a good visualization or a good imagery strategy to get you there is far more important. Imagining or visualizing the stages that you need to take in order to get there, and seeing yourself do it. And we actually have pretty good intervention data on this, showing that people who visualize, and they visualize in a very specific way the steps they need to take, more effective in enacting the behavior. Interesting.
And without digging into that too deeply, but is that something that's generally recommended daily, weekly? Like what's the integration of this visualization piece that the research is showing us might have an impact on the outcome?
Yeah, I mean, we've shown that a very brief intervention using imagery can actually be very effective. But yes, for sustained behavior change, people should use it on a regular basis. And, it's got to be pretty specific. And the ideas, or the way it works generally, is through kind of providing people with a template, but it also improves your beliefs. It motivates you. It increases your self-efficacy. You're much more confident in being able to do something if you visualize being able to do it. And again, it's, in many ways it taps into Bandura's stuff about observational learning, vicarious experience. It's not, you're not watching someone else do it, you're watching yourself do it. So you effectively become a self-model. That's one of the ways in which visualization or imagery is supposed to work.
All right, last one on my list here, personality traits. Where does that play? And is that something that's then completely out of control, or does a different personality approach things in a little different manner that anyone can then have an impact?
Yeah, look, personality, we kind of touched on it a number of times before, but personality can be influential, but I think its effects generally are overstated. And the reason for that is because people think that personality is really important. And so there's a sort of deep-seated belief in sort of, I think people like to think that I'm made like this. So they kind of
almost
let themselves off the hook. Yeah. They let themselves off the hook because I'm just that kind of person. But actually the effects of your genes, your dispositions, your personality are often overstated. And again, you look at the data on personality, effect sizes, they're there. They're not. It's not negligible. It's not something that you should dismiss. But the effect sizes are small. Wow. And so you look at personality for any of these kinds of health behaviors, the effects are relatively small. So just because you're an introvert, right, doesn't mean you're going to be introverted in every social situation, right? It depends on the context. Just because you're highly conscientious doesn't mean you're going to be a real grafter in the workplace, at home, in school, all these kinds of things. That's not the case, because there are situations. If you have low self-confidence, right, even if you're a highly conscientious person, if you have low self-confidence in a given situation, that situational effect is going to be far more prescient, far more important in determining your behavior in that situation than your personality.
And have you seen any, or maybe been involved with any studies where bringing that to someone's attention creates greater traction with their behavior change? So you bring a group in, you go through a training, research, go through the data, and they realize, wait, genes, personality, situational specific self-efficacy don't really matter? Oh my gosh. Well, maybe I could. Have you seen that outside of a N of one type thing?
Well, look, I think it can be influential, but I think that kind of approach won't be influential in the long run. And I'll tell you why, because that's very similar to the kind of approach where you give people information that their behavior is bad for them.
Good point.
Right? You're like this. If you tell people that it's not because you think you're like this or because it's your personality, that's not true, right?
They've lived their whole life.
May kind of be a revelation to them in that situation, but it's not likely to be very influential in terms of changing their behavior, just as telling a smoker or a drinker that cigarettes and alcohol are bad for them.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. All right. You recently published, in fact, it's the way we cross paths, a meta-analysis on effects of habit and intention on behavior. We've talked through a good chunk of that, but were there any surprises in that study that kind of had you look cross-eyed at it saying, well, didn't expect to see that in there? And by the way, just real quick, for the listeners, meta-analysis, folks, this is where they're looking at multiple studies and gathering the credible ones into kind of a pocket of information. So just so folks know what he's talking about here. So from that meta-analysis, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Take it away.
Oh, no. I think that's really important. And actually sort of knowing what these kinds of methods are is absolutely essential to kind of understanding what this research means to people in their everyday lives. So I think it's really important. And meta-analysis is becoming really, really important in general in terms of helping us understand, the myriad of data that we have is huge. And so making sense of that is really important. Yeah. And so now in this sort of habit meta-analysis, what we kind of identified was that people habit has an important influence on people's behavior. That's no surprise, of course. But one of the things we noticed was that there are behaviors for which people have high opportunity to develop as habit. And when that happens, habit is a very strong predictor and intentions make very little difference. And so for those kinds of behaviors, it's the likelihood is that people will form habits for them. And those can be good habits that lead to positive outcomes, I suppose, and habits and behaviors that might lead to maladaptive or poor outcomes. One of the things that was particularly interesting was the sort of role of behavioral complexity. What we found was that for more complex behaviors, the role of habit was much less influential, whereas for the sort of simple behaviors, people were much more kind of dependent on their habits.
An example of the complex. What would be an example of the complex?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think many of the behaviors, sort of behaviors which involve a lot of, they basically involve a lot of actions, a lot of
multiple steps.
Yeah, and it involves a lot of sort of elaborative thinking, and behaviors like physical activity are a good example, because even a relatively mundane physical activity like going to the gym or to the fitness center, that involves a lot of steps. You got to sort of think about, schedule. When's it open? You got to, what class am I going to attend? If it's a class at all, what's the transport? What equipment do I need? When am I going to go? Do I need to get some money together to pay? All these kinds of things. So it's a very sort of planned activity, and so you don't do that. You don't do it like an automaton. You've got to do the planning and that kind of thing. Whereas behaviors that are sort of much more simple, like, don't involve a lot of sort of steps like toothbrushing or even a lot of sort of snacking behaviors, things like that. They're relatively simple behaviors. And so they don't involve necessitate this very sort of elaborate thinking. And so they're much more conducive to being influenced by or controlled by habit. That said, though, one of the kind of recent perspectives is that it's not the behavior, the sort of behaviors, the actions per se that are the habit. It's really the initiation of that pattern of acting that becomes the habit. In other words, the habit is the sort of the instigation or the initiation of that behavior that sets in motion the sets of actions that are required in order to perform the behavior. So ultimately, it's the decision to do that behavior that becomes more automated or more habitual rather than the behaviors themselves.
Because it's no longer a decision.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But the decision becomes automatic. And so actually there's very little sort of conscious input in that decision. And so actually you kind of just set yourself up to performing the behavior. I already made the decision. So, then of course you don't act like a robot per se, but perhaps the decision was really quite thoughtless, was really quite habitual.
Yeah. That's huge key. All right. I mentioned Kelly McGonigal. We've had other James Prochaska, Bill Miller, Wendy Wood, Good Habits, Bad Habits, Tiny Habits, BJ Fogg. We've had all of them on the podcast. If we took their body of work off the table, is there a book that rises to the top of somebody that's listened to and they're saying, oh, I want more? Is there one for the layperson that you say, oh, this is a really good one, don't miss this one? Is there something that pops into your head with that?
Well, there are a couple of things. I suppose one of them is Why We Do What We Do, which was written by one of the founding fathers, if you like, of self-determination theory, Edward Deci. And it was co-written by a guy called Blast. I can't remember the first name. And it's a relatively old book at the moment, but it was a sort of popular text based on self-determination theory. And it outlined the sort of ideals and the ideas behind intrinsic motivation. Self-determination theory is the theory about intrinsic motivation, or one of them. And I think it's an important text. I think beyond the sort of the books about sort of habit and so forth. And it's a really important book, and it outlines sort of the importance of why behaviors should be internalized and should be self-endorsed in order for them to set in motion motivation to perform the behavior. And intrinsic motivation is all about that. But it's not just about doing behaviors you love or that are really just attractive. It's more about what their value is to you, and identifying, well, can this behavior be made more valuable to you? And it goes back a little bit to what I was saying before about identifying the behaviors that appeal to individuals, that will make their behavior change much more attractive and more relevant to them, to their self, their genuine sense of self. So yeah, that's a book that people might find worthy of looking up.
You mentioned two came to mind. Was there another one that sparked, or is that the one you want to really?
Oh well, yeah, I suppose the other one, the other kind of, well, it's not really it's not a book at all. It's a paper, and it's a really interesting paper by Ellen Skinner, who did some work on control and the idea of constructs of control, and it looks at the different types of ideas about control, and it's called A Guide to Constructs of Control. It's an academic paper, so it's not really a sort of public consumption piece, but it's one that stuck with me over the years. And it focuses on things like self-efficacy, but also about why behaviors are either means to an end, right, or focusing on the behavior as something which is important to you. And so they're not just a means to an end. There's something which is it's something about the behavior which is important as a process, and that's something that's sort of stuck with me over the years. So there's a couple of examples.
Okay, beautiful. Last question as we wrap it up here. I'd love to flip the mirror around a little bit. So we got the expert looking at himself in the mirror. Is there a behavior change for you that you'd personally like to tweak it's been a struggle? And as you reflect on yourself, you know the data, you're the guy, and yet you still struggle to make that change personally. Can you walk us through that, if there is one that pops to mind, kind of how you're processing that?
Yeah, no, I think it's important. One of the things I sort of noticed that I still struggle with. I like to think I'm getting better at it, but I'm very aware that it's problematic. Is kind of I don't know, my compulsive checking of emails, phone, that kind of thing, right? And it's getting worse because of the presence of devices and so forth.
Sure.
And I know I'm not alone, right? And I know it's not functional, but I find that I do it a lot, and it's because it's reinforcing. And so, well, actually, it's not. I know it's not.
It's reinforcing in some ways.
It's reinforcing in some ways, in the sense that I'm waiting for that really great email that has some really good news,
life-changing.
Right. And they're well, not so much life-changing, but at least the good news. Right. And they are very few and far between. Most of the emails are bad news, or just very mundane news. Right. And so yeah, I know what's driving the behavior. I know that I do it too much. I know that I'm not alone. All these kinds of things. Yet, I find myself doing that. And so there's the kinds of strategies that I'm employing to try and change that. Is obviously one of the most important things in terms of behavior is actually realizing you've got a problem, right? And so I that's become more of an issue, and something I've become more aware of. But the next thing is to say, okay, well, what can I do? And I know what I'm like, and so the only way I can kind of sort of do this is to just remove the opportunity, and it's very, very key. So I'm becoming more adept at structuring my own environment, so I just can't do the darn behavior, right? And so yeah, I got to get rid of devices. I got to remove them. So if I'm going to a restaurant or if I'm going out or whatever, put the phone away. That's it. And easier said than done, of course. And but yeah, those are the strategies I'm trying to do. Is just trying to. Okay, can I restrict and putting time limits on it? I'm going to treat myself, and that's what parents do with their kids. They want to, if they want their kids to spend less time on the iPad or whatever it is, other tablets are available. Then they just restrict the time for them. And so I'm going to treat myself like a child and structure my own environment accordingly. Say, okay, after 6 p.m., no devices. Right, that kind of thing.
Right. Beautiful. Thanks for opening that window for us. Dr. Hagger, thank you for doing this. Really appreciate it. We're talking to you. You're in Finland right now. We're out in the U.S. It's just amazing that we can have this conversation. So thanks for making it work with schedules and all. Really appreciate it.
No, I appreciate it. It's my pleasure, Brad. Really nice to be on the show. And thanks very much for inviting me on.
Great insights. I love that last section where he turns the mirror around and says, hey, I know this stuff, but I still struggle. It's a great reminder for all of us. If you'd like to tap into more insights on behavior change, I mentioned some of the previous guests. You can search under the Catalyst 360 podcast for people like Dr. Wendy Wood, Dr. BJ Fogg, Dr. James Prochaska, Dr. Bill Miller, or Dr. Kelly McGonigal. All of them build on some of the things he talked about today. If you have questions about pursuing your MBHWC approved coach certification or integrating best-in-class coaching into your organization, EAP, or wellness services, reach out anytime. Email is results@catalystcoaching360.com, or you can head over to the website, catalystcoaching360.com, and get some time set up to answer your questions. And now, it's time to be a catalyst. This is Catalyst Coaching 360's Dr. Brad Cooper. Make it a great rest of your week, and I'll speak with you soon on the next episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.